Good morning. It's Friday, September 27th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 357 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Sirens sounded once again in the Gush Dan region yesterday. When you hear Gush Dan, that's just another way of saying Tel Aviv and central Israel, where the majority of Israel's population lives. The threat yesterday was a ballistic missile fired yet again by the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen. The Israelis intercepted it with its long-range Arrow missile defense system. That's obviously good news, but it's remarkable that this ragtag group of fighters can continue to target Israel. They have mostly failed, but not for a lack of trying. We'll continue tracking the Houthis and all those other Iran-backed terror groups every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday right here at the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest on the show is Elica Le Bon. She's an Iranian-British-American lawyer and activist who has become quite popular on social media. I met Elica earlier this year when I appeared on the Dr. Phil show. And in case you're wondering, no, that's not something I ever thought I would ever say out loud before October 7th. But that experience did connect me to a number of impressive people out there, including Elica. We'll hear from her in just a few minutes right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Well, another ridiculous spat erupted between the Biden White House and the Benjamin Netanyahu government in Israel. The White House is trashing the Israeli leader for not jumping at a deal that might possibly somehow provide an off-ramp for the escalating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. First, both sides need to stop squabbling. Seriously, just stop. The more tension that Iran and its proxies see in the U.S.-Israel relationship, the more they're going to try to exploit it. You want to argue? Fine. Do it behind closed doors. Don't let your enemies see it, because when they do, they tend to be more violent, not less. You'd think that after 11 months, this would be better understood. Sheesh. But also, let's be realistic here. We can't really blame Netanyahu for not jumping at a deal. He doesn't want Iran or Hezbollah to believe he's desperate for a ceasefire. So he continues to hammer Hezbollah in Lebanon, just as his top advisors probe a possible agreement. Bibi knows that diplomacy alone has failed repeatedly as a strategy since October 7th. So he's invoking the great diplomat George Shultz, who said, negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table. I carry no water for Bibi. I say unabashedly that Israel needs an election that would, at minimum, be a referendum on Netanyahu's leadership. But don't believe the hype. Netanyahu needs to convince his enemies that he's just as ready to fight as he is to cut a deal. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Hamas and Fatah, the rival Palestinian factions that can't agree on the color of hummus, have reportedly agreed on a day-after plan for Gaza. Fatah is, of course, the dominant party of the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is its bitter rival. In 2007, Hamas seized control of Gaza after fighting a bloody civil war with Fatah. Hamas shot its rivals in the legs and arms and threw them off of tall buildings. Brutal stuff. And now, according to the Al Arabiya News Network, the two factions are ready to bury the hatchet, and Hamas is willing to cede control of Gaza to Fatah after the war. If I had a shekel for every time Hamas and Fatah tried to reconcile, I could buy a lot of falafel. Multiple attempts to broker Palestinian unity over the years have failed. Russia tried in February, China tried in April, and then again in July. The Chinese thought that they did it last time, announcing that Hamas and Fatah agreed to form a provisional national reconciliation government. That will happen, in my estimation, when the chief rabbi of Israel and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem sit down for a dinner of baby back ribs. But who knows? Maybe the 89th time is a charm. Headline 2, Israel eliminated the head of Hezbollah's drone unit. Mohammed Hossein Surur, a.k.a. Abu Saleh, oversaw the manufacture of Hezbollah's UAVs in southern Lebanon and directed drone and cruise missile attacks against Israel. The IDF took him out in a precision strike on a building in Beirut, near the site where the IDF eliminated senior Hezbollah commander Ibrahim Akil and more than a dozen other senior Hezbollah figures last week. The ranks of Hezbollah's leaders are thinning out. We can say this with certainty, but don't spike the football yet. As I have said on this program before, even with some of these spectacular strikes and operations, Hezbollah is still a very, very formidable force. There's a lot of fight left in that group, and they have a ton of munitions that they have yet to deploy. And it's for this reason that I continue to warn, beware of a war in the north. Headline 3, Washington imposed sanctions on a network involved in facilitating trade to enrich Hezbollah and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Yawn. Targeted sanctions won't do a thing as long as we don't put the regime of Tehran in a financial vice grip. And this White House refuses to do that for reasons that I can't explain. Okay, I know you want to know which IRGC thug can no longer use his ATM card in America. His name is Louis Al-Mallah. He used his family shipping company to support Iran's proxy networks. Al-Mallah's Syrian shipping magnate of a brother was sanctioned in 2021. This week, Treasury identified 4 ships in the brother's fleet and imposed sanctions on their company, which is based in, wait for it, Turkey. And speaking of Turkey, check out those explosive charges dropped by federal prosecutors against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. He reportedly accepted free travel on Turkish Airlines, took illegal contributions and other less than legal favors from his good friends in Ankara. A reminder, Turkey is not just a terror finance haven for Hamas. It's a corrupt regime that is trying to buy off our leaders here in America. All right, it's now time to introduce Elica Le Bon. As I noted at the top of the show, Elica is a prolific social media content creator. That's not something I used to say. Now I'm kind of comfortable with it. Anyway, Elica is a fierce advocate for a free Iran and a tireless critic of the regime that is standing in the way of her goal. I caught up with Elica yesterday from the FDD headquarters for this conversation, which we'll play for you now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Elica Le Bon.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you with us. You have become something of a social media phenom lately. I want to talk to you about that in a minute. But first, maybe just for our audience, just tell them a little bit about how you got here. You're an Iranian-American, and you've taken some very tough stances. But what's the background? What has informed your tough stances that we're
hearing? I mean, technically, I'm an Iranian, British, American lawyer. What has informed my stances, I guess, would be my history, of course, my family's history in Iran. My family having, been in Iran during the 1979 coup, where the Islamic regime took over Iran, and, witnessing the horrors of that, and witnessing, my family having been in Evin prison, my family having been executed, my family having been tortured by the regime. And, I think so much of what you come to understand growing up with a family that has had these type of experiences is the way that jihadists present themselves to the world versus who they actually are, which is actually something not to go on a tangent, but this is exactly what Shi Wang wrote about when he came out of prison in Iran, after all the studying he had done in the West versus what he had discovered, to only find out actually the Western world's perception of the regime in Iran is completely flawed. And that is exactly what's informed the conversation that I'm bringing to the Western narrative now.
Yeah, and you mentioned Shi Wang.
Shi Wang. He was
this is the Princeton PhD
correct.
student who's now working on the Hill. He's kind of reinvented himself. But let me just ask you. You mentioned the word jihadist as you speak about the Iranian regime. That's interesting because most people use that word primarily when they talk about Sunni jihadists. We talk about, Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the Taliban, or even maybe Hamas, but people don't usually refer to this regime as jihadist because it's Shiite. Why do you think that is the case?
I've never heard that distinction, to be honest. I've always used jihadist, and the experts that I've heard the term from also use jihadist. I don't think that there's a separation because at the end of the day, the goal is the same, right? The goal is the same, and when we're talking about what it is that the jihadists are aspiring towards. We're going back to the kind of Islamic revival movement inspired by Rashid Rida after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. We're talking about people who want to revive this concept of an oppressive state under Sharia law by any and all means, even if it involves invading sovereign nations and infiltrating their borders. So to me, the distinction between Shiite and Sunni is irrelevant. What's relevant is this distinction between a moderate and an extremist. And the extremist is who I refer to as the jihadist in furtherance of that revivalist movement.
Fully agree. Fully agree. I want to ask you, just if you would, to talk a little bit about the Iranian-American community. They obviously play an important role. We had a representative from Nufti on the program not too long ago, and we talked about the role that the Iranian-American diaspora can play here. Curious to get your thoughts on that as well.
So, even before October 7th, which was kind of when the Western world woke up to the Middle East, before that, a year before that was the Woman Life Freedom Movement after the death of Mahsa Amini, or I should say the killing of Mahsa Amini. For a long period of time, for the past 45 years, Iranians, both inside Iran and outside of Iran, have been urging the world to wake up to the true threat of the Islamic regime in Iran, which, as we know, is not contained to Iran. So I think this became the Iranian-American community has been so instrumental in the wake of October 7th in pushing this idea to the world that the Islamic regime is not just Iran's problem. And we've been saying this, right? And the reason it's not just Iran's problem is because of its proxies. Its proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthis in Yemen, Islamic Jihad, all of their proxies, which are for the purpose of asserting some degree of domination in the Middle East. And now, subsequent to these attacks, it's like it's really driving what the Iranian-American community has been trying to assert as part of this public conversation for such a long time, which is that the Islamic regime is not only a terrorist occupying force inside of Iran, but it is a threat to the broader Middle East. And this is the conversation that these are the pieces of the puzzle that Iranian Americans have been trying to put together.
And I think it's still an uphill battle. And I want to just ask about the Israelis here. Of course, the Israelis are the ones who are fighting all of these different proxies that you mentioned. They're fighting an Iranian strategy that we've widely identified as the Ring of Fire. This is the multiple proxy strategies. They have to fight the sort of tentacles of this octopus that is where the head is much farther afield in the Middle East. How do you think the Israelis are faring right now against these proxies? And should they be fighting the proxies versus fighting Iran itself?
So first of all, I would push back on the idea that it's an Iranian strategy or that it's Iran. I would specifically refer to them as the Islamic regime because that is what they are. And I just want to quickly just tell the audience why I say that. One of the things that lends legitimacy to this illegitimate regime is to appropriate things that are legitimate. So, for example, Iran, a nationality, a country, is a legitimate thing. And so when it's able to call itself Iran or Iranian, people see that as legitimate. I think if we stick to the definition of what they are, which is a regime that is based on, its own personal revivalist Islamic principles, it's not able to legitimize itself through those words. So as to your question, how Israel is doing in response to this, I mean, Israel during this period of time, the world is clearly very much against Israel because it doesn't understand the bigger picture. The reality is that if Israel is able to remove these proxies from Gaza, from Lebanon, wherever it is able to remove these proxies from, to me, Israel is curing those countries of cancer. And that is something to be grateful for because these things are a cancer. They don't just come here and set up shop and, kind of mind their own business. They come, they spread, they kill until they assert total domination, not just within those borders, but within the region. Because the point of this pan-Islamism is that there must be one contiguous region. Okay, it's not that the existence of a Jewish state frustrates the Islamic hegemony in the region. Okay, so it's not self-containing. So the way that I see it is that if Israel is able to take out these proxies with the precision strikes that it's been doing so well at doing, it is effectively curing these regions of cancer. The head of the snake, I don't know what that's going to take.
Yeah, I don't know either. And we can talk about that in a minute. But I mean, let's talk about the U.S. response then, because the U.S. has been taking fire from some of these proxies, right? We've lost 3 servicemen in Jordan back in, I guess it was late January, early February. We have an entire waterway that has been shut down by another Iran proxy, the Houthis. They've shut down the Red Sea, which is essentially responsible for something like 10 to 12% of maritime trade around the world. We seem to have a problem here with a strategy of our own, I would argue, in Washington. I think we've been a hot mess. Would you agree with that assessment? And if so, what do you think the U.S. needs to do to right the ship?
I absolutely agree with that assessment. And I think that assessment has come from, I believe that strategy, or lack of strategy, I should say, has come from a decades-long infiltration in the White House with the regime's lobby and, supporters of the regime. The problem is that the US right now is very weak. It is very weak, and the weakness of the US's strategy is exactly what undermines the US, and it is exactly the thing that the Islamic regime is assessing in doing the strikes that it's doing through its proxies, right? It sees Biden as weak. The reason it sees Biden as weak is that Biden doesn't enforce the pre-existing sanctions, okay? After Donald Trump left the JCPOA and applied the maximum pressure campaign, Biden seriously laxed on enforcing these sanctions to where Iran, the Islamic regime, was able to manufacture its highest oil exports in the past 5 years. And so, when there are no consequences for their behaviors, when the US continuously shows the Islamic regime that it's not going to respond to its threats, then of course it's going to continue to do the same, right? So it's very difficult for me to say what exactly needs to be done, but what is clear is that there needs to be a strong and resounding response. In my personal opinion, this isn't just going to come from the US alone. This is going to have to be a concerted effort, not just with the US, but with European countries and with Western countries in general, not just Western countries, all freedom-loving countries or any countries that are opposed to jihadism, okay, including UAE, Bahrain, whatever it takes. There needs to be a concerted effort where there are maximum consequences and maximum penalties for any engagement in this attempted regional domination, to make it so that the jihadists really significantly rethink their actions, and not only rethink their actions, become significantly economically impaired. And then once they are significantly economically impaired and they have no support in the international community, that is when the Iranian people are able to rise up and take the regime out themselves.
And I want to talk to you, this is the last question for you here, as we're starting to run out of time, but the people of Iran are really our best weapon, right? I mean, we always talk about it here at FDD that we need maximum pressure on the regime. That means sanctions, and it means political and diplomatic isolation. It means, the credible threat of military force on the one hand, but the other part of it has to be maximum support for the Iranian people. And that's been missing, hasn't it?
This becomes the point of contention or the point of controversy, because when we talk about arming the Iranian people, this is where we get into the conversation that particularly the American left and particularly the American, the Western left are very allergic to, which is this idea of regime change that is driven by the Western world. They call this imperialism when there's regime change in the Middle East by the West. Now, this is kind of getting hung up on a technicality. It is the Iranian people that are taking out the regime. aiding the Iranian people, arming the Iranian people is not imperialism, because it is an organically driven movement. Nobody is telling the Iranian people to do this. They want to do this themselves because they don't want this regime. They don't want this government. And not only that, let me add to the fact that we know that it was American involvement by way of Jimmy Carter that actually helped to bring this regime in, right? It actually, we've seen the exchanges between Khomeini and the White House, where Jimmy Carter helped to not only suppress the Iranian army, but distribute this anti-Shah propaganda that fomented this coup in 1979 in Iran. So, you know, if you want to go down that road of there should be no American involvement, there should never have been any American involvement in bringing them there in the first place. So you cannot break it and then walk away from it. You break it, you've got to fix it. And that means supporting the Iranian people, even if that means arming them to take out this regime.
Yeah, and there are, of course, lots of other things that we can do besides arming them, providing them with communications, providing them with financial assistance, giving them intelligence. I mean, there's lots of ways to help beyond arming them, but arming them may in fact be the logical conclusion that we will need to arrive at some point, because what this regime is doing to the region cannot continue. Elica Le Bon, I want to thank you very much for joining us this morning in the FDD Brief.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
All right, interesting interview there. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleagues Ivana Skradner and Mark Montgomery published a piece in The Hill following Putin's recent decree to increase the Russian military by an additional 180,000 active duty troops for his ongoing offensive in Ukraine. Ivana and Mark see a way to make lemonade out of lemons here. This could be a prime opportunity for the West to exploit discontent among ethnic minorities and the families of Russian soldiers. We can foment resistance to the war and exert pressure on the Kremlin to bring it all to an end. FDD CEO Mark Dubowitz teamed up with FDD editor Ben Cohen for a piece at the Jerusalem Post, building off the rumors surrounding Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar's demise. That has obviously not yet been proven, but my colleagues argue that regardless of the leader's status, the fact that we continue to hold our breath over it is a clear sign that U.S. diplomacy has failed. And finally, in case you missed it, check out the video from yesterday's event featuring former U.S. National Security Advisor and chair of FDD's Military Center, General H.R. McMaster. He was in conversation with FDD's Brad Bowman. They examined the many ways that the axis of aggressors, Russia, China, North Korea, and China, are sowing chaos, eroding rule of law, and undermining the United States and its allies. A sobering and fascinating discussion. I highly recommend catching that on our website, fdd.org/events, or the FDD Events podcast. That's all we've got for you today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest will be David Siegel of a terrific group called ELNET, which works with European governments to foster better ties with Israel. Not an easy task lately, but the conversation should be a good one. Until then, we'll keep tracking the war in the North. Here's hoping for a quiet weekend. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.